Jerusalem is the holy city of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. At the same time, it has also been one of the most conflict-ridden and war-torn places for over 2,000 years. So, how did it evolve from a Bronze Age human settlement into a sacred place for three religions? In its early days, the area where Jerusalem is located was called Canaan, and it was ruled by the Egyptian pharaohs. The earliest written record of Jerusalem dates back to 1350 BCE, when the king of Canaan sent a letter, written on a clay tablet, to the Egyptian pharaoh. The letter requested the pharaoh to send troops to defend Jerusalem. However, there is no record of whether the pharaoh ever sent his army. For the next few centuries, no more records mention this city, until the Bible brought Jerusalem to global fame to its followers. The Bible is a divine revelation. For history, despite its many mythical elements, it also serves as a chronicle of Jerusalem. The stories in the Bible are based on the oral history of the Hebrew people, often written down centuries after the events occurred. The book of Genesis in the Bible first mentions Jerusalem when it describes the patriarch Abraham visiting the priest of Canaan. Centuries later, Moses led the Hebrews out of Egypt, reclaiming their promised land, Canaan. With the arrival of the Israelites, Jerusalem also became home to a new religion, Judaism. During the time of Israelite rule, the region of Canaan was divided into 12 different tribes. Two large tribal groups emerged. The northern tribes called themselves Israel, and the southern tribes became known as Judah. Later, a warrior king named David united these warring tribes and established Jerusalem as the new capital. For the Jewish people, David built their holy city and brought the Ark of the Covenant, which contained the Ten Commandments. However, in the Bible, David is portrayed as a sinner with blood on his hands. He intended to build a temple to house the ark, but according to Scripture, someone with David's moral flaws was too unworthy to undertake such a sacred task. Instead, God chose his son, Solomon, to fulfill this mission. Although no traces of Solomon's first temple have been found to this day, it is believed to have been located at the site that later became an Islamic holy place. Due to the presence of the Dome of the Rock, archaeological excavations cannot take place there. While the stories of David and Solomon are steeped in myth, evidence suggests that a Jewish temple did exist during the time of Solomon's reign. After ruling for 40 years, Solomon died, and the kingdom of Judah once again splintered. The 10 northern tribes broke away to form the Kingdom of Israel. By the 8th century BCE, the Assyrian Empire had risen in Mesopotamia. After conquering the northern kingdom of Israel, the Assyrians advanced toward Jerusalem. As they approached, Isaiah, the prophet of the kingdom of Judah, warned that only the Messiah could protect the city. Isaiah prophesied that a king would come, bringing peace, and under his leadership, a new religion would emerge and spread throughout the world, turning Jerusalem into a universal city. However, at that moment, the immediate threat was the Assyrian king Sennacherib, who laid siege to Jerusalem. Just when it seemed that the city was doomed, Sennacherib suddenly withdrew his army. The Jews in Jerusalem believed this to be a divine miracle. Yet in Sennacherib's own records, he claimed that he had trapped Jerusalem like a bird in a cage and, after receiving enough gold to satisfy him, chose to leave after the death of the king of Judah. His son Manasseh succeeded him. Unlike other Jews, who worshipped only Yahweh, Manasseh introduced other deities into Solomon's temple. Outside the city walls, in the valley of Hinnom, children were sacrificed, a practice that horrified the Israelites. Over time, the name Hinnom became synonymous with hell, and this story in the Bible gave rise to the concept of demons and the division between heaven and hell. When Manasseh died, Judaism experienced a revival. Meanwhile, another empire emerged in Mesopotamia, the Babylonians. After overthrowing the Assyrians, the Babylonians ruled the Middle East. The kingdom of Judah became a semi-autonomous state. The Jews eventually rebelled against Babylon, and the Babylonian king led his army into Jerusalem, burning the city to the ground and completely dismantling the temple. Over 40,000 Jewish elites were exiled to Babylon. This marked the beginning of the Jewish longing for Jerusalem and the dream of returning home. Shortly after their exile, Cyrus, the king of Persia, conquered Babylon. He allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem and even financed the rebuilding of their temple. For the next 200 years, the Jewish high priests ruled Jerusalem until the time of Alexander the Great, when the city fell into Greek hands. As the Greek Empire gradually declined, a new empire rose in the Mediterranean, the Roman Empire. In 40 BCE, Roman leaders Antony and Octavian appointed Herod to govern the kingdom of Judah. During Herod's reign, he built a magnificent Jewish temple in Jerusalem, similar to Solomon's temple. After Herod's death, the Romans reclaimed control of the kingdom of Judah and co-ruled Jerusalem with the high priests. Amid this environment, a boy named Jesus grew up in Galilee. He believed that he was fulfilling Isaiah's prophecy. In the early days of his ministry in Galilee, his teachings centered on the impending end of the world. His vivid and direct speech attracted many followers. However, his apocalyptic revelations and criticism of the authorities also challenged the power of the high priests and the Romans around 30 CE. During Passover, Jesus came to Jerusalem's temple, like many other pilgrims. There, he publicly attacked the temple's priests and the Roman authorities. The Romans had previously executed all rebellious prophets, and Jesus was sentenced to the same fate, crucifixion. After Jesus' death, his followers gave him a traditional Jewish burial. According to the Gospels, 3 days later, Jesus resurrected and appeared to his followers, who became known as the Nazarenes. At this point, the Nazarenes did not see themselves as a separate religion and continued to worship in the temple alongside other Jews. In 66 CE, the corruption and incompetence of the Romans incited a Jewish revolt. When news of the rebellion reached Rome, Emperor Nero sent General Vespasian and his son Titus to crush the Jewish insurgents. After besieging Jerusalem for 4 months, the Romans stormed the Temple Mount. In the massacre at dusk, the siege of Jerusalem came to an end. The next day, Titus ordered the complete destruction of the remaining parts of the temple. After this devastation, the temple was never rebuilt. With the temple destroyed, the Nazarenes broke away from their mother religion, Judaism, and formed a new religion, Christianity. Under Roman rule, Christians were sometimes tolerated, while at other times, they were used as scapegoats and severely punished. This persecution continued until 312 CE, when Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. He began to rebuild Jerusalem, making it the religious center of his Christian empire. Constantine constructed a church on the site where Jesus was crucified, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Over time, Christians transferred many of the stories associated with the Temple Mount to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. For example, it was believed that Adam was buried beneath the church, and that Abraham nearly sacrificed his son there, rather than on the Temple Mount. As Byzantine control over the Middle East weakened, another religion began to covet the city's sanctity. In the 7th century, a new faith, Islam, emerged in Arabia. According to tradition, in 610 CE, in the small town of Mecca, a man named Muhammad was chosen by the archangel Gabriel as the messenger of God. While receiving divine revelations, Muhammad began to recite these sacred verses. Initially, he recited them aloud, but later they were divided into 114 chapters, ultimately forming a book, the Quran. Unlike Jesus, Muhammad performed few miracles, but one mystical experience forever linked him to Jerusalem. One night, Muhammad was said to have ridden a winged steed to the farthest sanctuary, where he prayed alongside the prophets of Judaism and Christianity. In Islam, this farthest sanctuary is considered the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, making the city one of the holiest places in the Muslim world. When Muhammad died in 632 CE, his successors were called caliphs, meaning leaders of the faith. 5 years after his death, 3 Islamic armies surrounded Jerusalem. Fearing a bloodbath, the Christians in the city began negotiating and agreed to surrender on one condition: that Caliph Umar personally guarantee that Christians would still be free to worship in the city. Thus, Umar secured Jerusalem for the early Muslims. In 685 CE, Caliph Abd al-Malik constructed the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount. Later, Abd al-Malik and his son built the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which means the farthest mosque. From that point on, the Jewish Temple Mount also became a holy site for Islam. Over time, the era of tolerance and inclusiveness began to fade. The Muslims in the city became increasingly exclusive. Whereas they once allowed Jews to pray on the Temple Mount, 80 years later, the Caliph banned Jews from entering the area altogether. In 969 CE, a mysterious Egyptian dynasty captured Jerusalem. The Egyptian Caliph claimed to be a descendant of the Prophet's daughter, Fatima, hence the dynasty was called the Fatimid Caliphate. Initially, the Fatimids were tolerant of Christians and Jews, allowing them to visit Jerusalem for pilgrimage. However, this tolerance didn't last long. In the year 1000, the Fatimid Caliphate fell into the hands of al-Hakim, a ruler who saw himself as a sort of Messiah, standing between man and God. He began a violent purge of the Jews, forcing them to choose between conversion or death. Many Jews fled Jerusalem as a result. Al-Hakim also turned his wrath on the Christians. During an annual Easter ritual meant to affirm the divinity of Christ, Al-Hakim became infuriated, believing it was a fraudulent act. He ordered the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to be leveled to the ground. The church would not be rebuilt for several decades, but it never regained its former grandeur. Not long after, in 1095, Pope Urban II called for a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem from the Muslims. The Christians aimed to remove the Muslim presence from their sacred lands. In 1099, during the First Crusade, Christian forces captured Jerusalem. The Crusaders slaughtered the city's civilian population, but did not destroy the Muslim holy sites. Instead, they repurposed the Dome of the Rock as a Christian temple, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque became the Temple of Solomon. Both buildings were transformed into churches, and Jerusalem once again became the capital of a Christian kingdom. Although the Crusader kingdom flourished for a time, the Muslims eventually reclaimed the holy city. In 1187, the Muslim leader Saladin defeated the Crusader armies and retook Jerusalem. Like the Crusaders before him, Saladin chose not to destroy the city. He instead removed all traces of Christian presence from the Temple Mount. Toward the end of Saladin's dynasty, his descendants made a reckless decision. They invited over 10,000 Mongol cavalrymen to Jerusalem. These riders completely destroyed the city and plundered its resources before leaving. Jerusalem was left in ruins, with only a small population of Muslims and a handful of Jews remaining. The next effort to rebuild Jerusalem came from a man who had risen from the slave markets to the pinnacle of power, Baybars, the Mamluk leader. After defeating the Mongols, Baybars declared himself the ruler of Egypt and Syria, and began the restoration of Jerusalem's sacred status in Islam. Under Mamluk rule, Jerusalem once again thrived, but this prosperity did not last long. By the early 1500s, the Ottomans had successfully conquered the Balkans and Turkey. To the north of Jerusalem, an elite Ottoman army defeated the Mamluks, and the keys to the Holy City were handed over to a ruler known as Selim the Grim. Selim entered the Islamic Holy City, and like his Muslim predecessors, showed tolerance toward both Jews and Christians. After his death, the empire passed to his 25-year-old son, Sulayman the Magnificent. Sulayman believed himself to be the emperor of the world and the ruler of Islam. His name, Sulayman, is the Arabic form of Solomon, and under his reign the Dome of the Rock was rebuilt. Jerusalem flourished once again under Sulayman's rule. By the 1800s, due to Jerusalem's status as a Christian holy city, European powers began vying for influence over the region. France supported Catholicism, Russia backed the Eastern Orthodox Church, and Britain promoted Protestantism. Each power began constructing churches in Jerusalem. At the same time, the Jewish and Arab elite families started establishing their own quarters in the city. The Jewish population in Jerusalem began to grow, and by 1880, Russian persecution of Jews intensified. Many Jews fled to Jerusalem to escape, hoping to find refuge in their ancient homeland. This time, an Austrian journalist witnessed a growing tide of anti-Semitism sweeping across Europe. He foresaw the worsening destruction in the future, and believed the only way for Jews to protect themselves was to establish their own state. He published a book titled The Jewish State, and the theories in this book became the foundation of Zionism. In 1914, World War I broke out. To secure support in the Middle East against the Ottoman Empire, Britain turned to both the Arabs and the Jews. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George sought to gain the favor of the Jewish people. He believed that if Britain helped end the Jewish exile and restore them to their holy land, millions of Jews in the United States and Russia would support Britain's war effort. Thus, Britain announced its intention to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine. When the Ottoman Empire was defeated, its lands were divided among the victors. Britain was granted control over both Jordan and Palestine. Under British rule, Jerusalem once again became the capital. As Jews purchased more land from Arabs, Muslim leaders in Palestine grew concerned that the Jews would destroy Islamic holy sites and rebuild the Jewish temple. Just like throughout history, Jerusalem's sacred sites became a focal point of conflict once more. When Hitler came to power in Germany, more Jews fled to Palestine, and the inevitable war between Britain and Nazi Germany drew closer. Once again, Britain chose to side with the Jews, but to appease the Muslims in Palestine, The British government proposed setting limits on Jewish immigration and promised Palestinian independence within 10 years, yet made no mention of a Jewish state. Despite this, Britain continued to intercept Jewish ships fleeing Hitler's massacre in Europe and prevented them from entering Palestine. This did not win favor with the Arab leaders in Palestine, nor did it please the Jews, who began to firmly oppose British rule. By now, both Muslims and Jews in Palestine were rebelling against British authority. Jews demanded a Jewish state, while the Arabs, who vastly outnumbered the Jews, sought independence. Both sides claimed Jerusalem. Britain, caught in the middle, decided to turn to the newly formed United Nations. After a UN vote, it was decided that Palestine would be divided into two parts, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs. Due to Jerusalem's unique status, the UN would directly govern the city. After over 2,000 years, the dream of a Jewish state in the Holy Land was about to become a reality. The Zionist movement declared the establishment of Israel, but Palestine rejected the UN resolution, and war broke out. Surrounding Arab nations formed an alliance and invaded the newly established Jewish state. Faced with the threat of annihilation, the Jews fought desperately and ultimately emerged victorious. Over 750,000 Palestinians were displaced, and in 1949, Israel and Jordan signed an armistice agreement. Jordan took control of East Jerusalem, while Israel held the western part of the city. This ceasefire lasted until 1967, when Israel went to war with its Arab neighbors once again. Facing threats from three sides, Israel launched a preemptive strike and quickly seized Gaza and the west bank of the Jordan River, reclaiming the ancient Jewish holy city of Jerusalem's Old City. For the Jewish people, Israel had finally reclaimed Mount Zion. This marked the end of exile and the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. However, despite their victory, controlling Jerusalem brought new challenges. The question of how to share the city's sacred sites, a question that has haunted Jerusalem for centuries, remained.